Rain fell softly over the narrow streets of the old city, tapping against the windows of a small diner called Rosa's Kitchen. The diner was not fancy. Its red booths were worn from years of use, and the smell of coffee and fried onions always hung in the air. It was the kind of place people visited when they wanted something simple and warm, a place where nobody asked questions, and nobody expected trouble. Elena Rossi had worked there for almost 3 years. She was 24, quiet, and careful with her words. She kept her brown hair tied back and her eyes low, moving between tables with soft steps, refilling cups and clearing plates without ever drawing attention to herself. Elena had learned long ago that in this neighborhood, it was safer to be invisible. Trouble found people who stood out, and Elena had enough trouble already. Her mother was sick, and every extra dollar Elena earned went toward hospital bills that never seemed to shrink. She rarely spoke about her life to anyone. The other waitresses knew only that she came in early, left late, and never complained. What they did not know was that every night, after her shift ended, Elena sat by her mother's bed and read to her until she fell asleep, praying that tomorrow would bring enough money to keep the lights on. Dominic Marchetti was a name that made grown men lower their voices. People in the neighborhood called him the Wolf, though never to his face. He ran the streets with a cold precision that left no room for softness. Those who crossed him disappeared from conversations, as if they had never existed. Fear followed him everywhere, not because he demanded it, but because everyone around him had learned that fear was the only language that kept them safe. Dominic had built his world on control. He trusted no one completely, expected respect through intimidation, and had long forgotten what it felt like to be spoken to honestly. People smiled at him out of fear, agreed with him out of fear, and avoided his eyes out of fear. It had been that way for so long that he no longer noticed it. It was simply his life. One night, after a tense meeting with a rival group had gone poorly, Dominic found himself walking through the rain, with nowhere particular to go. His men trailed a few steps behind him, silent and watchful. He was in a foul mood, his jaw tight, his thoughts sharp as knives. When he saw the dim lights of Rosa's kitchen glowing through the rain, he decided to step inside, more to escape the weather than for any real reason. The diner went quiet the moment he entered. Conversations dropped to whispers. The old cook in the back peered through the kitchen window, then quickly looked away. Everyone recognized him, and everyone knew better than to stare. Elena did not know who he was. She had been in the back restocking napkins when he arrived, and by the time she came out to take his order, all she saw was a tired-looking man in an expensive black coat, sitting alone in a corner booth with 2 silent men standing near the door. "What can I get for you?" she asked, keeping her voice polite and steady, the way she always did. Dominic barely looked at her. "Coffee, black." Elena nodded and hurried to get it. When she returned, her hands were trembling slightly, though she did not know why. Perhaps it was the strange stillness of the room, or the way the other customers avoided looking toward his table. As she set the cup down, her sleeve caught the edge of the saucer, and a small splash of hot coffee spilled onto the table, some of it landing on his hand. Dominic's expression darkened instantly. Years of built-up frustration from the failed meeting rushed to the surface, and before Elena could apologize, his hand shot out and gripped her wrist tightly, hard enough to make her wince. "Watch what you're doing," he said, his voice low and sharp. For a moment, the diner froze. Every eye turned toward the corner booth. Elena's heart pounded, but something inside her, something that had been quiet for far too long, refused to stay silent any longer. She had spent years being careful, years staying small, years swallowing her fear to survive. But in that instant, gripped by a stranger who thought his anger gave him the right to hurt her, something in her snapped. Without thinking, without planning, Elena raised her free hand and slapped him across the face. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Time seemed to stop. Dominic's men moved forward instinctively, but Dominic raised a hand, stopping them without even looking their way. He was too stunned to react any other way. Elena stood frozen, her chest rising and falling rapidly, suddenly aware of what she had done. Every customer in the diner stared at her in disbelief. The old cook nearly dropped a plate. Nobody, in years, had dared to touch Dominic Marchetti like that, let alone strike him. Dominic slowly released her wrist. His cheek burned, not just from the slap, but from something deeper, something he could not immediately name. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, for the first time. She was breathing hard, her eyes wide with fear and defiance all at once. She did not look away from him, even though every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, without a word, Dominic stood, straightened his coat, and walked out of the diner into the rain. His men followed silently behind him, exchanging confused glances but saying nothing. Elena stood there, shaking, as the diner slowly returned to life around her. Whispers filled the room. Someone asked if she was all right. She nodded, though her mind was racing. She fully expected consequences. She expected trouble to find her the way it found everyone who crossed men like him. That night, she barely slept, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. Not that night, not the next day. 3 nights later, Dominic returned to the diner. This time, he came alone, without his men, without the cold authority that usually surrounded him like armor. He sat in the same corner booth and waited quietly until Elena approached, her nerves tightening with every step. "I didn't come to cause trouble," he said before she could speak. His voice was different this time, quieter, almost uncertain. "I wanted to apologize for grabbing you. That was wrong." Elena stared at him, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Men like him did not apologize. Yet there he sat, his eyes lowered slightly, his hands folded on the table like a man unfamiliar with the words he had just spoken. "You're the first person who has touched me in years, without either running away or trying to please me," Dominic continued. "Everyone around me either fears me or pretends to like me because they're afraid not to. You didn't do either. You just reacted, honestly." Elena did not know how to respond. She simply nodded and returned to her work, though she could feel his eyes following her throughout the evening. He left a generous tip and walked out quietly. He came back the next night. And the night after that, he never caused trouble, never raised his voice, never made anyone uncomfortable. He simply sat in his usual booth, ordered coffee, and watched the diner around him with a strange kind of curiosity, as if he were seeing an ordinary life for the very first time. Over the following weeks, something began to shift, quietly and slowly. Dominic started talking to Elena during quiet moments, asking about her day, her thoughts, small things he had never bothered to ask anyone before. Elena, still cautious, kept her answers short at first. But little by little, she found herself relaxing around him, surprised by the calmness in his voice when he was away from his usual world. She learned that Dominic had grown up with nothing, that his mother had died when he was young, and that the streets had raised him in ways no child should be raised. He had built walls around himself so thick that even he had forgotten what was behind them. Elena, in turn, shared pieces of her own life, carefully at first, then more openly. She told him about her mother's illness, about the long nights at the hospital, about the fear of losing the only family she had left. Dominic listened. Really listened, in a way few people ever had. He said little in response, but something in his expression told her that her words mattered to him. One evening, Elena received a call from the hospital. Her mother's treatment costs had suddenly been paid in full, every outstanding bill cleared without explanation. Confused and suspicious, she asked the hospital staff who was responsible, but no name was given, only a mention of an anonymous donation. She knew immediately who it was. The next time Dominic came to the diner, Elena confronted him, her voice firm despite the emotion behind it. "I don't want your money," she said. "I don't want to be someone you're trying to buy peace with." Dominic shook his head slowly. "I'm not trying to buy anything," he said. "I just didn't want you to keep carrying that weight alone, that's all." Elena studied his face, searching for the calculation she expected to find, the hidden motive men like him always seemed to carry. But she found none. Only quiet sincerity, unfamiliar and awkward on a man who had spent his life being feared rather than understood. "Why do you keep coming here?" she finally asked. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me?" Dominic was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as though searching for the right words. "Because you slapped me," he said finally, "and it was the first honest thing anyone has given me in years." Everyone else gives me fear, or lies, or flattery. You gave me the truth. I didn't know how much I needed that until you did it." Elena did not know what to say. She simply nodded, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. In the weeks that followed, changes began to appear in Dominic's life, small at first, then more noticeable. He started pulling away from the more dangerous parts of his business, handing over responsibilities to trusted men, distancing himself from the violence that had defined him for so long. His own associates noticed the shift, whispering among themselves about the change in their boss, though none dared question him directly. Dominic was not naive enough to believe he could erase his past. He knew the weight of the things he had done, the years of fear he had built his name upon. But for the first time in a long while, he wanted something different. He wanted to be a man who did not need fear to be respected, a man who could sit in a quiet diner and feel like an ordinary person, if only for a few hours each day. Elena, in turn, found herself looking forward to his visits, though she remained careful, never fully certain of what their strange connection meant. She was not foolish enough to think that a slap and a few conversations could undo years of darkness, but she saw effort in him, real effort, and that was enough to keep her from turning him away. Months later, on a quiet evening much like the one where it all began, Dominic sat once again in his corner booth, watching Elena move through the diner with the same quiet grace she always carried. The rain fell softly outside, tapping gently against the windows. He thought about how strange life could be. A man who had spent years building a name people feared by strangers and enemies alike, had been changed not by violence, not by power, but by a single honest reaction from a shy waitress who refused to be afraid of him. It was not a grand transformation. He was still learning, still struggling with the weight of who he had been. But he was trying, and for a man like Dominic Marchetti, trying was more than he ever thought possible. Elena approached his table with a fresh cup of coffee, setting it down carefully this time. No accidents, no spills. Their eyes met briefly, a quiet understanding passing between them, unspoken but clear. He had spent his whole life being feared. It took one slap from a woman who wasn't afraid of him to make him wish, for the first time, that he could be a different man. And in the warm, quiet light of that small diner, far from the streets that had shaped him, Dominic Marchetti began, slowly and carefully, to become one.